So, hi everyone. Um, we thank you for being here on this Q&A. Today we have a luxury of guest. He was a keynote speaker for our conference in Puerto Rico a couple of years ago, and now we have him again. So now he will be for us for 1 hour. So Jorge wants to talk about, well, he's a very known professional of the information architecture field and user experience field. He wrote the famous polar bear book, The Last Edition, with Louis Rosenfeld and Peter Morville. And he's an independent consultant based in San Francisco now, working for big companies and projects on the past few years. So today, Jorge wants to talk about design after COVID, which is something that is very, very trendy right now. So all the questions that you want to ask him, please go to the Q&A section in the Zoom platform and start asking him questions. And I don't know if you want to do some introduction, Jorge.
No, that's fantastic, Claudia. Thank you so much for that. I think that you said what needed to be said as far as an introduction goes. I just want to thank everyone for being here. And just to tell you, well, do you want me to start? Should I just go ahead?
Sure.
So I just wanted to say that when Claudia first reached out to me about doing this, my first impulse was to do a Q&A. And I thought that we would do it kind of in a focused way around this topic that I think is in a lot of our minds, which is what is going on and how are things changing and how might we respond through our practice in a way that helps make a better world. And with that in mind, and I'm saying this as a preamble because I do have some slides, and what I'm hoping to do is to spend a little bit of time at first telling you where I'm standing on these issues to set the context, but hopefully we'll be able to switch to more of a Q&A format. And what would work best is, as I'm walking through my slides, if you can post your questions on the Zoom Q&A window. And that way, when I finish the presentation portion of this, we can just kick the conversation right off. And we already have a question, which is fantastic. And it's a great segue into the presentation. So without further ado, I am going to actually share my screen. And Claudia, can you confirm that you can see that?
Yes, it's perfect.
All good.
And fantastic. All right. So I'll address the first question right off the bat. So my little deck here is actually titled Design in the Post-Pandemic World, which is a slightly different angle than design for COVID, right? What we are concerned with here, as I was saying earlier, is the question of the world that we're moving towards and the degree to which we as members of the design discipline have agency in the form that we give that world. All right. So that's the main focus that I'd like to give our time together today. So I want to start by telling you that the realization of what's happening came to me relatively slowly. And I'll illustrate how that happened by sharing with you a little vignette from my family's life. So my daughter, Ada, and she's the one on the left here, who's laughing hysterically in the Mad Hatter's Teacups ride at Disneyland. So she's turning 10 next week.
So,
And
Jorge, I'm sorry to interrupt you, but I don't see, I don't see a photo. Do you see a photo, Claudia? I think we might only be seeing half your screen.
oh no, let me try that again.
I didn't want to interrupt you, but I want to make sure everybody's.
No, thank you for interrupting me, because if you can't see visuals, that's not going to work, is it? Let's try that again. Oy. Can you see the presentation title? Claudia, you're muted.
Yes, it's perfect. It's perfect. People are seeing the picture, Jorge.
Okay, great.
So yeah.
All right.
Yeah,
So
yeah, it looks good.
All right, great. Thank you. Sorry about that. I don't know what happened there. So Ada, like I was saying, Ada's turning 10 next week. And in January, she told us that she wanted to celebrate her birthday at Disneyland. And I've had prior experiences vacationing at the Disney theme park resorts. So I knew that if we wanted to have a vacation in June, we needed to book pretty soon. So I went ahead at that time and I reserved a vacation for our family. And you have to pay for these things in advance. So there was some commitment there, right? Like I had committed to this thing. And when I did that, when I went ahead and made those plans, I was aware that there was a virus happening. But my understanding was that it was something that was happening halfway around the world in China. And it was something that I was aware of through the news, but it was kind of like an ambient news item. It was certainly not the topmost item in the news at the time. It was just one of many things that I was aware of. And that understanding changed on a day-by-day basis. Like it started becoming more and more of a news item. And eventually it became clear that this was something that was not just happening in China and that it might come over here to the US. And the moment where my where things started kind of clicking for me was a particular week where we went into kind of lockdown mode here in the Bay Area. San Francisco was one of the first cities in the US to issue shelter-in-place directives. And so at that point, I started working from home. And in that very same week, Disney made the decision to shut down their theme park in Shanghai, that's a big deal. Those theme parks don't close on a whim. So at that point, it was pretty clear that this was a pretty serious situation, but it was still unclear to me what it meant for us, other than the fact that I was now working remotely. And we had these plans that we had committed to, but I didn't know what this would mean, if anything, for that. Now that understanding evolved over time as it became more and more clear how serious this was. And I remember having a conversation at the breakfast table with the family where I said, well, I don't know if we're going to be able to move forward with our plans for this vacation. And at one point, Disney closed not just the Shanghai park, but they closed all of their theme parks around the world, which was an even more radical step, right? And at that point, I was like, okay, so we have these plans, we have made reservations, we have paid for these reservations. These things are closed. We don't know if they're going to be open again. We don't know when they're going to be open again. So there was a great deal of uncertainty in the air. And it started dawning on me that this might be something that was going to be a situation for the long term. Now, needless to say, we're not traveling to Disneyland next week. Disneyland is still closed. And it has been closed for more than a couple of months at this point, which is the longest that those theme parks have ever been closed. And I'm telling this story and running the risk of sounding like I'm trivializing the situation. And I just want to say right up front that I realize that it sounds very kind of entitled and privileged to talk about, not being able to vacation at Disneyland when millions of people have lost their jobs, and people have gotten sick and died and lost family members. And I'll say that we're very privileged in my family that we are still able to, first of all, that we're healthy and that we're able to continue working remotely. But I'm mentioning this story because I think it is a microcosm of how, it captures this idea of how this story, this thing that is happening, went from being something that we were aware of, and all of a sudden it became kind of the main focus of our attention and really has upended our lives. So like I said, Disneyland has been closed now for well over 2 months. And at the beginning of May, the Walt Disney Company had their quarterly earnings call, and they announced a drop of 91% in their profits year on year for that quarter. And it was the result of a few weeks of this situation. So the changes have come about immensely forcefully and catastrophically, and to almost an unimaginable degree. Like in January, when we booked this vacation, we could have never imagined that we would find ourselves in June in the situation that we find ourselves now. So these changes have come about very fast. It's been very unpredictable. It's been very difficult for us to make decisions, skillful decisions about the future. And we are here. And what I wanted to do was take a moment to reflect about where we are and how we move forward as designers. So what are the implications for us as we move ahead? I'll say before I move on that Disney has done the right thing. They've canceled everyone's reservations, returned our money, etc. But that's obviously costing them a lot of money. So I want to be clear, and this is to address a question that came up in the chat about what do we mean by the post-pandemic world here. So when I'm talking about the post-pandemic world, I want to make a distinction between 3 stages of what we are experiencing. The first stage is the immediate impact of this situation, the kind of first shock, right? And we all know the statistics here. I know that we have people all over the world. I've included here just numbers for the US, but the immediate statistics are really appalling. We have over 2 million people in the US who are infected with this virus. There have been over 117,000 deaths. Our healthcare systems are under tremendous stress. We have unemployment rates that are through the roof. Massive amount of people have lost their jobs, with tremendous impact to the economy. Entire industries are being decimated, particularly the hospitality and restaurants, for example. We had our favorite neighborhood restaurant closed about a month ago, never to reopen again. And all those people have lost their jobs. The rest of us who are able to work are doing it either under tremendous personal risk or doing so from home. So big changes, right? That's the immediate impact of this thing. The second stage is what you could call kind of a transition period towards some kind of new normal. And that is the stage that we currently find ourselves in, right? Like, so we see that there is a gradual reopening. Different countries are going about this differently. Different states here in the US are going about it differently, right? So we have folks here from states that might already have fully reopened. Here in California, we're taking things a little more slowly. And there's obviously the risk that this will lead to possible further waves of this thing, of this virus. I think that during this transition to a new normal, we are going to continue seeing a mix of remote and in-person work. Some of my clients are continuing in remote working mode for the time being, even as other parts of the economy open up. Those that can do so will continue working remotely. And of course, there are major social events that need to continue happening. Here in the US, we have a major election happening in the fall, which, given the timelines that we've seen for potential vaccines, I think it's safe to assume that we will still be living during this kind of more transitional phase as that election plays out, with the result that there are still a lot of questions about how that's going to happen. How do you vote during a situation where you have to keep physical distance from other people, for example? So that's the second stage. And then the third stage is what I'm calling the post-pandemic world. And I'll be upfront and say, we don't know what that looks like. And I don't think we can know what that looks like. I've been thinking a lot about 9/11, September 11, and how that changed our lives. There was a period immediately after those attacks that was really kind of confusing as we sought to figure out how we were going to respond to that. Then there was a period of time where we experimented with a bunch of different things. And then finally, we settled into new ways of being that try to address the safety risks that were made manifest during that event. So for example, air travel has never been the same after that event. And I'm assuming that there are things that are going to change permanently as a result of this pandemic that we're going through. This pandemic is a major shock to our societies, our economies, our systems. And we can expect that such a major shock will bring with it long-lasting shifts in values and practices. So I don't know yet what those are, but there are some that we can start speculating about, right? Because we already see the outlines of these things changing. And I've listed a few of them here. I'm not going to go into detail for all of them, but I think that we've already seen a shift from our willingness to work remotely versus in person. And that's a trend that has been changing slowly over the last couple of decades. And this event has accelerated the adoption of remote work a lot, right? So there's a question about to what degree do those changes stick, and if and when we go back to working in offices, what does office life look like, right? So we can expect that there are going to be shifts there. Another area where we might see shifts is our willingness to trade off our privacy for an increase in the reality or our perception of greater security, right? So we've seen experimentation happening around things like contact tracing apps, and different countries are taking different approaches to these things, some of which are more respectful of people's privacy than others. And different cultures have different perceptions of what these things mean, right? So I think that we can expect some shifting happening in this axis as well. Like I said, I'm not going to cover all of them, but there's a couple more that I do want to point out. And by the way, I must note right up front, I don't want to make any predictions as to where I think these things might land. I just, nor whether any of them will effectively change or not. I just think that these are some that are kind of in play. Our willingness to decentralize the production of essential goods might shift as a result of this, right? So when the first impact of this thing hit the US, one of the situations that we found ourselves in was shortages of various basic goods like N95 masks, right? And the supply chains around the world were disrupted by this situation. So if we are sourcing our N95 masks to a single place and supply chains become disrupted, then we're going to have a problem with the availability of those goods, right? So this is something where we might find our values shifting. Another one which is related to this is our drive for ever more efficient means of production in opposition to greater resilience, right? So by resilience, you can think of redundancy, like putting in systems, fail-safe systems that kick in when other systems go away. And those things are expensive, right? So if we want if we want to make things more cheaply, we might eschew resilience. Well, this crisis has shown that we might want to put more resilient systems in place, which means more redundant systems, which means perhaps some things get more expensive as we look to ensure that they will be in supply when we need them. The final one here, I've labeled a continuum between beliefs and data. That might not be the best labeling for this, but I'm struggling to describe it. But what I'm trying to capture here is the degree to which we lend credence to people who have expertise, demonstrable expertise in their areas of competence, as opposed to people who have strong opinions about those things. We are seeing a struggle right now between that, right? And it's playing out in the news where medical experts have an opinion about whether it is safe to start doing certain activities again. And other folks have other opinions on that are informed by different areas. And we are going to be finding ourselves posed with the question, whose advice should we take? And why do we consider that advice to be worth our attention? So this is an area where we might see the needle moving. Again, I don't know in which way it's going to move. It could be that there is a reaction against further, away from expertise, or it might be the opposite. But I do expect that, given the magnitude of this shock, that it's something that might shift. And here is the kicker. We're talking about a post-pandemic world, but the reality is that there is this event, if nothing else, is a reminder of the kind of precarious situation that we find ourselves in all the time, just how fast things have changed and how fast our complacency at the status quo has evaporated, should serve as a reminder that we have other risks over our heads, right? So there could be other pandemics, perhaps another resurgence of this virus, or an even more serious virus, right? We've been hearing for decades about climate change as a disruptive force. Political instability. So the past 3 weeks in the US, we have seen protests, these protests for equality and justice in the wake of the murder of George Floyd, which are another huge disruption, right, to our societies. There might be wars. There's always a threat of those things, right? And we haven't had a major war in a long time, but those things aren't completely out of the picture, right? More in the realm of sci-fi, in my opinion, at least, we might see something like a rogue general artificial intelligence emerge. And we've, again, been reading about those things for a long time. There might be threats that we can't even imagine, so they're not even in this list right now, right? I didn't include the cliche of the asteroid impact here, but the point is, it behooves us to think more generally about the situation we're going through and think about how we might respond more skillfully to times like these. So the question is, what are times like these? Like, what are these situations? What are the characteristics? And there's an acronym that's been used by the US Army War College, and it's called VUCA. And they used it to, and I think it describes the situation we've been going through pretty accurately. And they used it to describe the world after the Cold War, the geopolitical landscape after the Soviet Union, the Soviet Empire dissolved. And the acronym stands for volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. And I think that these words describe the situation that we've been experiencing very accurately, right? So, like I said, like we made this plan in January, and in a couple of like a few weeks' time, all of a sudden it was up in the air, and there was a period there where the situation was changing in a few hours. Like you would be tuned into the news and it would feel like hour by hour things were getting more and more weird. Uncertainty, right? Like, so there was this period of time after we had made this reservation and paid for it where we didn't know the state of our reservation. I think that Disney didn't know the state of our reservation because they couldn't plan for the reopening of Disneyland. They did not have the cause and effect relationships down to make good predictions about when it was safe to reopen. There's a great deal of complexity, right? The situation has all of these forces that are driving it, and we have no idea how these forces relate to each other, right? And there might be forces that we don't even know about that are influencing the relationship, right? So there is a great deal of ambiguity. We don't know whose voices to listen to. We don't know which data points are important, et cetera, right? So VUCA is, I think, a pretty good framework to think about the situation we've been going through. And VUCA, when you're living through times of VUCA, you find it difficult to act skillfully, right? Because you lack clarity about what's happening. And what's worse, we don't know how to gain that clarity. We don't know what we need to do to make better decisions. There are many factors that are affecting the outcomes, and conditions are changing very, very fast, right? So I heard someone a couple of weeks ago in a webinar say that the last, what was it? It was something like the last 10 days feel like the last 10 days are the longest 8 months, the longest 10 months that I've experienced, or something like that. And there has been this feeling that time has weirdly compressed, right? And it's because things are changing so fast. And as a result of all of these things, we can't predict the results of our actions. And this makes it very difficult for businesses, organizations, and individuals to make plans for the future, which is evidenced by our little Disneyland story. So what can you do about it? How do you act skillfully in these conditions? Well, you won't be surprised to know that given that this is an established framework that has been around for a while, there's been people giving thought to these things. And there's a lot of resources if you want to Google this. I just want to point you to one. This is a book called Leaders Make the Future, and it was written by Bob Johansen, who I think is a former president of the Institute for the Future, which is kind of a think tank that thinks about future scenarios, right? And in this book, he lays out 10 skills that leaders who want to make a difference in a VUCA world need to bring to the table. And I'm not going to cover the 10 skills, but I'll say that he has this very nice reframing of the acronym that kind of summarizes the 10 skills. He says that volatility yields to vision. So you need vision, right? Uncertainty yields to understanding, complexity yields to clarity, and ambiguity yields to agility. Now, why am I bringing this up in a presentation about design? Well, it's because if you look at those words, vision, understanding, clarity, and agility, which are what we need as societies, as organizations to make skillful decisions in this world. And you think about who is well positioned to help with these things, you might realize that this is in part what designers do. I don't know if you all have seen this diagram. This is called the design squiggle, and it's kind of a high-level representation of what the design process looks like, right? So design is not just a way to make things more usable, attractive, and engaging. Design is about making the possible tangible, starting from a very messy set of conditions that we don't yet understand well, which is why we do research, right? So the design process starts with this kind of ambiguous mess at the left, and you, through a feedback loop where you make things and put them into the world and test them against real conditions, you slowly narrow down the field of possibilities to solutions that might work. So I know that feels a little abstract. So I wanted to land this by saying that there are a few skills that I think that we can hone as designers to help make our work more valuable as we go about helping to give form to this post-pandemic world. And I will touch on them very briefly here. So the first is systems thinking. So if there's anything that the last few months have taught us is how interrelated we all are and how interrelated our societies are, our institutions, our production facilities, right? So we need to get better at understanding cause and effect relationships, how different configurations of components lead to different outcomes. Knowing how to intervene skillfully in systems, right? Like you can't just make abrupt changes in some systems if you don't want them to get out of order, right? Modeling future behavior. We need to learn how to do that, to think about the whole, not just the parts, right? I often, when I talk with designers, I often get the feeling that we're much more focused on the parts than we are on the whole. And I think that this situation calls for us to look at things more holistically. I think that we need to have greater strategic awareness of our role, right? Like, so if we are doing research in an organization, that research is not just in service to making better products and services. In some ways, it serves as the eyes and ears of the organization as a whole to help them get greater clarity of where it stands with relation to the context that it's operating in, right? So knowing that design is a more strategic endeavor for organizations and knowing how to talk about that in those terms is going to be important for us going forward. And this requires that we understand the difference between politics and governance, right? Like I often hear about folks in organizations talking about encountering political resistance to their efforts. And politics are a thing, and it's a thing that we need to learn to grapple with. But there are also forces that that are related, that have to do with governance, that we don't pay nearly as much attention to in organizations. And they are intimately related with politics. But we have to get better at both. And we have to understand the difference between both. We have to become better communicators, right? So this requires that we adopt active listening skills. We learn to sense the needs of our audience, which I might add is really hard to do when you're presenting over Zoom like I am right now, right? Because I can't see you. But we need to get better at these things. Conveying abstract ideas in understandable and relatable ways, right? Like I was saying that we need to get better at systems thinking. Well, that means thinking abstractly. And a lot of people are not comfortable dealing with abstraction. So that is something that you need to work at, and we can work at it. We have all the tools at our disposal to be excellent communicators of abstract ideas. Research and synthesis. I don't think that I need to convince this audience of the importance of research in yielding insights for organizations. I do wish that more designers were more aware of the role that research plays in their work and their work plays in research. So we make things to gain feedback. That is how design works. You make a thing, you put it in the world, and you see how the world reacts to it, right? So we need to be more research-minded in general. We need to get better at iterating collaboratively, making these things that we're putting out into the world, and making them not as solo practitioners, but in teams, right? And we have fabulous tools. Tools keep getting better and better for working in teams at various levels of fidelity. And that is something that we need to actively work at. And finally, and this is more of a meta skill, I think that we have to become much more flexible. And by this, I mean bringing to the work more of what in the Buddhist tradition is called the beginner's mind. This idea that you might be a highly experienced person, and the very fact that you are experienced and an expert at something places a set of blinders on you, and you have to actively work to transcend those blinders so that you can approach situations with curiosity, playfulness, a commitment to expanding your own boundaries, right? And abandoning your comfort zones. And we have to do that because things are going to keep changing very fast. So I think that we need to do these things. I think that the future of the design profession lies in thinking more about how we design the things that design the things than we do on the kind of production work of the low-level granular stuff, right? And we have to do that because we are not in business as usual mode, right? Like we are literally at a threshold where the disruption is opening up the possibility to rethink many systems that have been broken for a long time. And skillfully intervening in those systems requires that we think about our work at a bit of a higher level. So I'm going to leave you with this quote from Bucky Fuller, which I think articulates this mindset very nicely. He said, "We are called to be the architects of the future and not its victims." And this is a moment in time where the future is uncertain and it can take many directions. And if we think about the work that we do at a high enough level, I think that we can help influence those directions towards more humane ends. So that's what I have for you. I think we have about 18 minutes, and I'm wondering if we have any questions we want to address at this point.
There are some questions in the Q&A, Jorge, if you want to go over there.
Okay. So, I mean, I hope that we have answered your question about what we mean by design for COVID. Daniel brought us a lot of remote experiences for everyone. Do you think information should be ready? I'll just read it out. So COVID-19 time brought us a lot of remote experiences for everyone. Do you think information should be ready in a different way to deliver for the mainstream audience? I am not entirely clear on the question, Daniel. Should be ready in a different way to deliver for the mainstream audience. I'm not clear on what you're asking there, but I will try to parse this. I think that
like the way we present the information.
Yeah, I think the situation is reconfiguring a lot of things, and one of them is how we share information, right? Like we've seen a tremendous growth in activities like the one that we're doing now. It feels like every week I get invited to take part uh, as a spectator, not as a presenter, but every week I get invited to participate in webinars like this one, right? And one of the beautiful opportunities that this opens up for us is that it makes it possible for us to join areas of practice, conversations about areas of practice that are not our main area of practice, right? So I have been a very active member of the information architecture community for a long time. And every year I go to the information architecture conference and I mostly listen to voices in that community. And over the past 3 months, I have been exposed to more voices from more communities than I have before, if for no other reason, for the fact that I can do so fairly easily without having to travel to conferences and make a big financial commitment to doing so. So that brings with it both the opportunity for us as people who are curious about the world and wanting to learn and adapt, like I was saying earlier, but it also, as presenters, brings the requirement that we find ways of packaging our messages so that they can be understood by a broader audience, because we can assume that there are going to be people joining our webinars who are not our traditional audience, right? So this is an invitation for us to be much more mindful, just because there's now so many more opportunities for us to participate in these things. I don't know if that's what, Daniel, if what you had in mind with that question, but that's what comes to my mind. I'm going to take another one here. So Marta, universities will emphasize remote usability testing in their syllabi. Now pandemics will be a possibility to consider when thinking of e-commerce, education, production, or even voting. Yes. One thing we didn't talk about at the beginning when we did the introduction is that besides my consulting practice, I also teach. I teach in the graduate program, the Graduate Interaction Design program at the California College of the Arts. And the pandemic, the shelter-in-place orders and the lockdown happened here 2/3 into our spring semester. So we had to transition from in-person teaching to remote teaching, and we had to do it fairly quickly in a matter of 2 weeks. This spring, I was co-teaching 2 classes. One of them was easier to transition than the other, just because of the subject matter and the way that the classes were set up. And my experience so far with remote testing is that some ways of testing and some types of research activities are going to be more feasible and more productive online than others. I would imagine that things like stakeholder interviews are quite doable remotely, whereas something like a contextual inquiry is not going to be as useful remotely, right? So, yeah, I don't know where the university angle comes in there. We'll emphasize remote usability testing in their syllabi. I think that not just universities, right? Organizations as well. I know a lot of people who are grappling with this issue. How do we do remote research? All right, let me see. Daniel, you had the clarifying question. Do you think we need different design now? I think that we need design that is more systemic in nature and more strategic, right? I think it's a cliche now to say that it's not business as usual anymore. And I think that for us as designers to try to carry on with our work as though our work is still about making more engaging, usable, attractive, legible widgets is disingenuous. What the world is asking of us now is that we rethink key systems. That is what the world needs right now. It doesn't need a more usable thing. I mean, those things are important, obviously, but it's the broader questions that need answering now. And I think that we have a particular skill set that other disciplines provide in different ways, but we have a particular take on it, right? Like if you're in an organization and you're trying to make a major business decision, you have various ways to go about it. And design, what I'm trying to say here is design is not just for implementing the results of those decisions. Design can also be used to help organizations make better decisions. Why? Because design can give organizations sensing organs where we have these research abilities that that help us gain information about the state of the world, the context we're operating in, the mental models that our users and customers bring to our relationship, synthesize insights from those data, and then make something with those insights that you can test to generate further data. That is a very powerful ability that we bring to organizations. And to think of ourselves as just making more engaging things or better things or things that lead to higher conversions, I think is to sell us short. Let me see. Okay, Hannah, do you have any thoughts on how we could use design to prevent misinformation? That is a big question. And to me, again, it points to the importance of systems thinking and understanding the big picture. I think that design, to answer you directly, I think that design can help us prevent misinformation, but to do it effectively requires that we look at the incentives that drive misinformation in the first place. I think that there is a great deal of misalignment right now between the ways in which information comes to us and how the entities that bring information to us are remunerated for that service. I think that as long as we have coupled our information mechanisms with selling our attention, we are going to have this problem of misinformation. We have to find a way to overcome that first, because that to me is part of the foundational problem behind misinformation. I don't know if that answered that question. And I hear some activity happening in the background. I'm wondering, Claudia, if you or someone else has something that you want to chime in on.
Yeah, there's a couple more questions here in the chat. I read the first one to you. So Jack Holmes says, with lots more people using video as part of their everyday lives, do you expect us to be having to design video into more of our solutions?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I would invite you to think about it more broadly. It's not just video, it's the ways that we meet, right? One of the key, I didn't put this one in the slide that has the various continuums that are kind of pulling against each other. But one that we might find our values shifting on is our understanding of what things need to be done synchronously versus asynchronously. I think that we have this kind of video fatigue happening right now, because we have been asked to transition our ways of working very fast so that we're all working remotely. And we've been trying to implement the old ways of working using new technologies. And the old ways of working had us coming together in meetings, right? Meetings are a big part of how we do information work. And you've heard the cliche that a lot of meetings could have been an email. And I think that that is something that is going to become more and more apparent over time, that there's a lot of things that we're meeting about that could have easily been handled in something like a Slack room or a Microsoft Teams environment, right? Which are asynchronous. Those don't require that we do the whole video thing. The video thing is useful in that we can see each other. We can get a little bit of information from our body language, nowhere near as much information as we get when we meet with other people in person. And I, for one, think that the current solutions, which are all frankly very similar, Google Meet and Zoom and Skype and WebEx and GoToMeeting and all these things are very similar. And I don't think that we've seen anywhere near as much exploration of what we could do with synchronous meetings over the internet. I would love it if one of the outcomes of this situation is that we find more innovation happening in that space.
And we have a last question, Jorge, from Gloria Alcayaga. She says, she asks, do you think it would be great to teach human interaction design in primary or secondary schools?
I don't know if human interaction design seems like a very specific thing. I'm not a big fan of the phrase design thinking. I think it's an important concept that that has been somewhat trivialized. But I think that the ideas that we think about when we think about design thinking are important, and it's important that we start kids down that path as early as possible. Design, like I said during the presentation, design is not just a way of making better things. It's a way of making things better. It's a way of knowing the world. And it's a way of knowing the world that involves making things and putting them into the world. And it's something that kids do very naturally. Kids are, especially younger kids, are always making things and showing them and seeing how people react to them, right? And in some ways, when they do that, they are sensing the bounds of what is acceptable, the bounds of their world. So this notion of like knowing by making is something that I think comes very intuitively to them. And we teach kids about science, fairly early on. We teach them about literature. Those are ways of knowing the world. And I think that design is a way of knowing the world. And that we can start kids fairly early on. I think that it would be a better world if we do that. I don't know if that answers your question, Gloria. We have a couple of minutes. I'll say something else about this. So I'm assuming that when you say human interaction, you mean interaction with digital devices, human-computer interaction. I think that there is a gap right now in our educational systems in that the reality of the world that kids are functioning, and I have to say I have 3 kids, so I already told you about my daughter Ada. I have 2 other children. So I've seen them grow up in this world where they are surrounded by and operating in digital devices. They're probably on digital devices right now as we speak, learning and reading and listening to music and doing all these things. And there's the question of how do you design for these things, which I think we've already touched on. But there's also the question of literacy, like basic literacy about what it means to interact with these things. The understanding, for example, that when you are interacting with these things, you are generating a trail of data, and that data is being used to build a profile of you, is something that everybody should know about. Everybody, right? And I don't think that it's as widely known as it is. And we would do well to teach more literacy of what it means to function in such a world pretty early on. Not just to kids, to parents as well, by the way.
We have a couple more questions. I don't know if we can answer them because we are kind of on time.
Yeah. So let's do this. My Twitter handle is on the screen there. So if you have further questions, feel free to tweet at me.
Okay. Thank you very much, Jorge, and thank you for everybody that attended this webinar Q&A session. It was great. It was a great perspective. We almost everybody, we don't know what will happen next, so it's good to do some reflection and some thinking. And join us in other webinars. We have a bunch of webinars that are coming on uxba.org webpage. So be alert and we'll keep you posted about the future events. Thank you so much, Jorge. It was a great pleasure to have you here.
Thank you. And thank you all for being here.
Thank you. Bye.